this video, we begin discussing how chess pieces move on the chessboard. However, before exploring how the pieces move, we want to emphasize that to be successful at the game of chess, a player has to recognize the capabilities of each piece, and furthermore, that the pieces must work together as members of a team. I've actually seen some beginners move the same piece repeatedly until that piece is captured, and only then do they move another piece. And in other cases, I've seen folks move different pieces, but there's no thought of how these pieces are going to cooperate or work together. In playing the game, the players alternate moves. The first player to move is always white. After completing a move, black then makes a move. The process continues with white, then black, then white again, until the game reaches its conclusion. By the way, the ultimate goal of each player is to attack the opponent's king so that it has no escape. This is done by delivering checkmate. In general, checkmate against a lone king cannot be accomplished by a single piece. The pieces of the attacking side must coordinate the attack. Before we take a look at the movement and capabilities of each piece in our army, consider the concept of moving a piece. That is, what does it mean to move a piece or to make a move? Well, when a chessman is moved, it may be relocated to an unoccupied square, or it may capture an opponent's piece by moving to the square on which the opponent's piece sits. Whether moving without capturing an opponent's piece or by capturing an opponent's piece, a chessman, when it's moved, always assumes a new location on the board. That is, it's placed on a different square. So in this video, we'll discuss both methods of moving each piece. With the exception of the king and queen, each player has multiple pieces of the same type. Each player has 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, and 8 pawns. As we know from our earlier discussion, the white pawns start the game on the 2nd rank, and the black pawns start the game on the 7th rank. To identify some particular pawn, we identify the piece that it stood in front of in the starting position. For example, the pawn that is on the square labeled D2 is immediately in front of the white queen. This is often referred to as the queen's pawn. The pawn on the square labeled G2 is in front of the white king's knight, so it is sometimes called the king's knight pawn. The pawn that is on the square labeled A7 is immediately in front of black's queen's rook, so it's called the queen's rook pawn. Sometimes we refer to the pawn by the file on which the pawn is located. For example, the pawn on the square labeled F7 is called the F pawn because it's on the F file. Now, because both white and black have an F pawn, it is better to refer to the pawn on the F7 as black's F pawn and the pawn on F2 as white's F pawn, rather than just generally use the term F pawn. Each type of piece in our army has unique characteristics. The pawn is the only chessman that cannot move backwards. A pawn can only move forward. However, once some piece is directly in front of a pawn, that pawn is unable to move because it is said to be blocked. The piece that is blocking the pawn can be of the same color, could be from the same army, or it could be a piece of the other color. What this means is that a pawn cannot jump over another chessman. Now, in general, a pawn moves forward along a file 1 square at a time. However, when any pawn is moved the first time from its starting position, it has the option of moving forward only one square, or it could move forward 2 squares. This option applies to every pawn. For each pawn, the option of moving 2 squares can only be taken when the pawn makes its first move. After a pawn has made its first move, that pawn can only advance 1 square at a time. Let's discuss the details of blocking with respect to a pawn. In this diagram, we have stars on the squares where the white pawns on the board could possibly move. The pawns on A3, B5, and D2 can each move forward 1 square. Now, the pawn on A3 obviously is not on its original square, so it has given up its option of being able to move 2 squares, and the same is true of the pawn on B5. Now, the pawn on D2, on the other hand, is on its original square, but it does not have the option of moving 2 squares because there's a pawn, a black pawn, 2 squares in front of it. So that pawn is preventing the pawn on D2 from moving 2 squares, but it could still move 1 square. The pawn on G2 is on its original square, thus it has not been moved. There are no pieces in front of it, therefore this pawn could move either to G3 or to G4 on its first move. Now, the pawn on E6 is blocked by a black pawn on E7. It cannot move at all. Now, all pawns shown in this diagram are blocked. None of them can move. And that goes for both white and black pawns in this particular diagram. Now note the color of the chessman that is blocking the pawn is not important. Any piece that is in front of a pawn blocks the pawn from forward movement. Now note that blocking is not something unique to pawns. It can happen with other chess pieces. When we look at how the other pieces move, we'll see that those pieces may be blocked by pieces that are of the same color as the piece. What makes a pawn different from the other pieces is that pawns can be blocked by pieces of the opposite color or by pieces of the same color. But the other pieces can be blocked only by pieces of the opposite color. Now, consider the black pawn on G4. It's blocked by a black pawn on G3. So one black pawn is blocking another black pawn. However, the pawn on G3 is also blocked, but it's blocked by a white pawn on G2. So again, the color of the piece in front of a pawn does not matter. The pawn simply cannot move forward. Let's look at how the pawn makes a capture of an opponent's piece. Okay, the way in which a pawn makes a capture is a little bit different than the way it moves. Remember that it can move forward one square within a rank. But when it captures, it actually moves forward, but it moves one square diagonally, either to the left or to the right. If we take a look at this position, there are a number of situations we can discuss. First, the two black pawns can each perform a capture. The black pawn on B6 can move diagonally to C5 and capture the white knight. The black pawn on C3 can move diagonally and capture the white pawn on d2. Note that these black pawns could move forward one square as an alternative to making a capture. The two white pawns in the diagram can also make captures. The white pawn on d2 can move forward diagonally and capture the black pawn on c3. Again, as an alternative to making the capture, the white pawn on d2 could move forward. Because it's in its original position, it could move to either d3, advancing one square, or d4, advancing two squares. Now the white pawn on g2 is a little bit more interesting, because this pawn could capture diagonally on f3 and take the black rook, or diagonally on h3 and capture the black bishop. It cannot move forward because it's actually blocked by the black knight sitting on g3. There's a little bit more that can be said about the movement of the pawn, but we'll save that for another time. Now let's move on and discuss the rook. A rook can move to any empty square on the file or rank on which it currently stands, provided that no men of either color block the path of the rook. What this means is the rook is not able to jump over a piece. In the current diagram, the rook stands on the d5 square. The arrows that we're showing in this diagram indicate the potential paths through which the rook could move. So the rook, being on d5, could move to any square on the fifth rank or any square on the d file. In both cases, the rook can move to any of these squares because there are no pieces in its path. In the current diagram, there are pieces in the path of the rook, and they limit the movement of the rook. The rook cannot move to a square occupied by a piece of the same color, because that piece is said to be blocking the rook. So therefore, the rook could not move to the square occupied by the white knight, b5, nor could it move to a5 because it cannot jump over the piece. And likewise, the white bishop is blocking the movement of the rook. But on the other hand, the rook could move to a square occupied by a piece of the other color. So the rook could move to d7, capturing the bishop, or the rook could move to f5, capturing the pawn. But again, the rook could not move beyond the bishop. It can't jump over the bishop, nor could it move beyond the pawn. It cannot jump over the pawn. So again, we see limitations on the movement of a piece by other pieces present on the board. When a piece threatens to capture an opponent's piece, the threatened piece is said to be attacked. The piece that is threatening to capture the other piece is said to be attacking the threatened piece. A piece that attacks a square occupied by a friendly piece, that is a piece of the same color, is not attacking the piece, it's actually defending the piece, it's protecting it from the opponent's attack or possible attack. So in the current diagram, the white rook is attacking the black bishop on d7. It could capture that bishop. It is not attacking the black knight, nor is it attacking the black bishop on a5, because it can't reach those. In one case, the knight is on a different rank than the rook, And in the other case, the bishop is shielded by the white knight. Because remember, the rook cannot jump over a piece. Also note that the rook is not attacking the black queen, because the bishop on d7 is kind of protecting that. The rook cannot jump over the bishop to get to the queen. So kind of combining the concepts from the previous display with what we're now looking at here. Now, if the rook captures the bishop on d7, the queen will then capture the rook. Black would lose a bishop and white would lose a rook. Giving up one piece for another piece in this way is sometimes called trading pieces, or it's called exchanging pieces. In the current diagram, white has 2 rooks and black has 2 rooks. The 2 white rooks are defending one another. Likewise, the 2 black rooks are defending one another. Additionally, each black rook is attacking a white rook and vice versa. So if a white rook captures one of the black rooks, then a black rook can capture one of the white rooks. This would be an even trade, with neither side gaining any advantage in material. The bishop. The bishop always moves diagonally along squares of the same color. Thus, a bishop that begins the game on a light-colored square will always move to another light-colored square. Likewise, a bishop that begins the game on a dark-colored square will always move to another dark-colored square. This is a property that is unique to bishops. They are restricted to a particular color. Now, in discussing the color restriction of a bishop, it's a good time to remind you of a point I've made many times. A player must know how to coordinate the pieces, that is, how to use the features of each piece. Because one bishop is limited to light-colored squares, and the other bishop is limited to dark-colored squares, a pair of bishops can be quite powerful if they work together. Now, unless the bishop is on a corner square, it has the option of moving along different diagonals, and this is shown in our diagram here. For example, the black bishop shown in the diagram is currently sitting on the f8 square. The bishop could move along one diagonal and land on either g7 or h6. That same bishop has the option of moving along the other diagonal, where it would be allowed to land on e7, d6, c5, b4, or a3. And again, these 2 diagonals for the black bishop are depicted in the diagram with these yellow lines. There are similar options for the white bishop. And again, we've indicated with these black lines the potential squares to which that bishop could move. Now, like a rook, the moves of a bishop can be limited by pieces that are on squares within its path. If a piece of the same color as the bishop is on a square in the path of the bishop is not allowed to move to the square occupied by that piece. There's a concept of blocking that applies here. It also is not allowed to jump over the piece. If an opponent's piece occupies the squares in the diagonal of the bishop, then the bishop potentially could capture that piece. This is done by moving the bishop to the square where the opponent's piece is sitting, and then removing the opponent's piece from the board and placing the bishop on that square. So in the diagram, the white bishop is situated on the e4 square. This bishop could move to the d5 square or the f3 square on one diagonal. But again, that's as far as it could go because it is effectively blocked by pieces of its own color. On the other diagonal, that bishop is allowed to move to the squares b1, c2, or d3 in one direction. It's allowed to move to f5 or g6 in the other direction, and additionally, it could actually go to h7 and capture the black pawn. Let's say a little bit more about the movement of the bishop. We've mentioned how the moves of the bishop can be affected by other pieces sitting on squares of the diagonal along which the bishop might move. Look carefully at the diagram we present here and think about the moves and captures the white bishop is allowed to make from the e4 square upon which it sits. The white bishop is effectively blocked by a white knight on c6. Therefore, it is not attacking the black bishop on b7. Remember, it is not able to jump over a piece. The white bishop is attacking the black knight on g6 and has the option of capturing it. However, the white bishop is not attacking the pawn on h7 because the black knight is in its path toward the pawn. Again, the bishop is not allowed to jump over the knight to gain access to the h7 square. Okay, with that being said, let's look at a little bit more in terms of the behavior of a bishop or characteristics of a bishop. Because a bishop is limited to squares of one color, there are situations where the movement of a bishop could be very seriously or severely limited. We sometimes hear the term bad bishop. It's not a case that the bishop is behaving badly. It's just that it's not living up to its potential. Its moves are very limited. In this position, the black and white pieces include a bishop. The bishops are of the same color. That is, they're both occupying light-colored squares. The white bishop is blocked. It's by its own pawns. It's kind of locked in, very limited movement possibilities. So in a sense, it's a prisoner and really doesn't have any option of escape. It can never attack an opponent's piece because it can't get out of its little prison. So the white bishop is considered a bad bishop in this situation. Now consider the black bishop in the position. It's not blocked by its pieces, and it has many potential squares to which it can move. It's very mobile and could help other pieces in its kingdom. Because of this, the black bishop is considered a good bishop. So the terms bad bishop and good bishop really describe the capabilities or flexibilities of the bishops. Now, consider how play might proceed from the position we see here. Black's bishop is on e6. It could move to c4 and attack the white pawn on e2. White defends the pawn by moving his bishop from g2 to f1. Now the pawn is defended. However, black simply backs up a square and goes from c4 to b5. keeping pressure on the pawn on e2. He's continuing to attack it. White has no moves other than to move its bishop, and when it moves its bishop, it gives up the defense of e2, and then black can capture the pawn on e2. Just like enjoying a holiday meal, we do not want to take in too much at one time, so we need to digest what we have consumed. So that's as far as we're going to go with talking about how the pieces move in this video. But let's recap what we have talked about. In this video, we covered how to refer to the pieces on the chessboard. We also discussed movements of some of the pieces. We talked about the way the pawns move, including the captures that the pawn could make. We talked about how the rook could move, including how the rook could capture. And we also talked about the bishop and how it moves and how it could make a capture. We discussed the concepts of attack and defense and looked at this with some interesting examples. And finally, we discussed good and bad bishops. Now, from our examination of pieces thus far, we should realize that at the start of the game, both the rooks and the bishops are blocked. They can't move. There are pawns sitting in front of them, so there's no way that they can move forward, and there are pieces on either side of them. They are not able to make the initial moves of the game. Looking ahead to our next video, we'll see that the king and the queen are also initially blocked. However, we'll see that the knight has a special ability, the ability to jump over pieces, and we'll bring that into our discussion as we continue. So next time, we'll continue our discussion of how the pieces move, part 2.